let's dive into, starting to dive into like, the idea of like firmware for miners. Big picture, like, what is overclocking and underclocking, and how can that be useful for different miners?
I love that you start there because it is exactly where almost everyone starts, and it's probably, and it's ultimately it is the primary functionality that you get from firmware, but it's not nearly as important without the context of why and when you over or underclock. So for anyone who's not familiar, overclocking and underclocking are where you adjust the clock speed of a Bitcoin miner. So if you purchase an S19 or S19J Pro, or whatever from Bitmain, you get it, they deliver it, whatever, you plug it in, it has, or before you plug it in, you look at the nameplate, there's a very specific 96T, 104T, whatever, that's terahash. We call that nameplate hash rate, right? Um, that hash rate is fixed with the stock firmware. Um, Meaning when you plug it in, it's going to go that fast unless it's broken, and it's not going to change. If it gets really hot and your miner starts to overheat, you'll probably lose some hash rate, or at the very least, you'll use more power for the same amount of hash rate, and then that's it. It's fixed. There's no control, um, and so for operators in a dynamic power market like Texas, that may not be ideal. Um, for instance, if you have contractual obligations to maintain a certain amount of demand on the grid for the really affordable power rate that you've negotiated for, you may have to maintain operation regardless of how hot it is outside, right? And if your miner can't keep up with that because the stock firmware doesn't give you any control over it, you're kind of up a creek, right? So what firmware allows you to do is says, okay, your nameplate is 104 terahash. Well, you see that it's really hot outside, so let's start to dial back the clock speed. You can think of it as kind of like horsepower, or not necessarily horsepower, or yeah, let's go with horsepower, and then you can chip it. I don't know if you're familiar with that analogy in the car world. There's special microchips you can put in certain cars, and it'll give you more or less horsepower.
Hmm.
Um, so basically, you can get more or less performance out of your miner depending on the operational parameters. So more meaning overclocking, or less meaning underclocking. It's pretty simple. Well, whoa, that's a drastic simplification. Um, Operationally, it's pretty simple. The mechanics of firmware are anything but simple because this is a ground up build. A lot of options out there are basically using the stock firmware and then adjusting certain things to give some control to users. But our strategy was to actually take it from the ground up. So we just ignore any operations, any software or firmware that's already on the machine. Start from the ground up with our own miner that we built in the programming language Rust.
Nice. Yeah. I mean, it's very fascinating to think about overclocking and underclocking. When I originally thought about this, I thought back to like 2021 when every, public miner and private miner in the world was like, let's just get as much hash rate as possible. Maybe that's like building immersions and overclocking to the moon. And then now it's like just to get more and more hash rate because it was so profitable to mine Bitcoin back then. And now it's like underclocking is kind of the next big thing where it's like, okay, energy prices were higher, may still be high for some people. Price of Bitcoin is down, mining difficulty is up. Let's underclock these things, earn less Bitcoin, but pay for even less power and we become quote unquote more profitable. And so now underclocking, I feel like, is the new thing. Would you agree? Like, is underclocking like the underrated thing in Bitcoin mining right now?
It has absolutely emerged as a sneaky option for miners to leverage in this recent bear market. I have to give props where props are due. Isaac and Reed at Cathedra, they did a really comprehensive study on clock speeds, power consumption, and they posted on Twitter. It's all open to anyone who's curious about it. Um, but yes, underclocking is a very sneaky beneficial option depending on market conditions. So like the thing that kind of simplifies it is if you a lot of people think about the price of Bitcoin, the difficulty having all these things, and while they're relevant to the the operations of miners, you can simplify the analysis if you just think about hash price. Um, Hash price is how much Bitcoin or US dollars, depending on the exchange rate at the time, but the base level of hash price is how much Bitcoin you get for a given amount of hash rate at any point in time. Luxor has hash rate index, and you can go and look at the hash price over time. So if you think of hash rate as a commodity, which we do, um, that commodity has a price. So if you map it over time, you can look at hash price. So when hash price is up, it means either Bitcoin price is up or network activity is down, right? So when you have less network participation, you get more Bitcoin per block, or per petahash or terahash, whatever your unit of hash is, which generally translates to more dollars. But again, it's a single metric that helps you simplify your analysis. So if hash price is up, you may want to overclock. But for the past year, with the bear market, um, hash price tanked, and there were a lot of people right on the margins. We saw it hurt a lot of different miners, and I would not be so bold as to say that firmware would have saved them. There are numerous complexities to running a mining operation, but it is an extra tool in the tool belt of miners that gives them some flexity in responding to market conditions, whereas you may be able to reduce your OPEX because when you underclock, you're consuming less power. When you're consuming less power, your OPEX is going down, right? Because everyone saw power prices go a little bit crazy in 2022. Combine that with Bitcoin price going down, so your hash price was going down, revenue was down, and OPEX was up. It was a really tough market for miners. So firmware gives you a tool in the tool belt to where um, I think Reed and Isaac have said publicly they were trying to get as many S19s into the same power supply as they were putting in S9. Now, the silicone in an S19 is way more efficient than that in an S9. That lets you get more hash rate out of the individual machines. But if you want to maintain longevity, because that's ultimately another factor, is if you reduce your clock speed and your voltage, you get a longer lifespan out of your silicone in general. There's two factors that affect the silicone. It's temperature and voltage. And if you can reduce voltage and reduce clock speed, you reduce temperature. So bringing all these variables down increases your longevity, reduces your OPEX. Ultimately, it should reduce your maintenance expenses as well because you're not taxing the machines as much, so you don't need to go repair them as much. Your fans are running slower. The benefits do start to compound when you're in a bear market and you need to conserve on cost, when you need to tighten the belt. Um, that may come to be extremely beneficial when we approach the halving. No one can predict the price of Bitcoin, obviously. I mean, people try, but um, by the way, what's the latest on the Balaji bet? How close are we? I forget how many days away we are, but I'm itching to see if we get there. That'll be fun. But
I feel like we're like 50 days away or something like that.
plenty
Running out of
time.
time.
Oh, that's plenty time. Um, so yeah, with as you're tightening the belt around halving, like maybe miners are going to have their revenue cut in half overnight. Um, if they're not acting right now to place every tool on the table or in their repertoire, like they're running severe operational risk when it comes to that time frame. Because if Bitcoin hasn't doubled overnight in US dollars, their power bills are going to be about the same. They're going to have to account for that somehow, right?
Yeah, definitely. I think that was it's very interesting to think about this. Like, I guess I want to know like how much can underclocking actually like improve your margins? Like in my mind, obviously if you have like a 100T machine and you cut the terahash in half to 50, if your power costs just get cut in half, you don't really do anything. Like your margin percentage is going to be the same. Like if you do underclock to a certain amount, what can a miner maybe expect like their margins to increase by, or like the energy efficiency of their machine, if
So
that
I'll be
makes
honest,
sense?
that's one of the things we're struggling to quantify right now, just because we're still relatively early in the process. I can give you some qualitative data, but I can't quantify it yet. We're actually actively working to build some test labs, if you will, to start to really do some in-depth analysis, because we want to be able to come to users and potential clients and say, look, this is exactly what you stand to gain. Um, I can tell you qualitatively that when you reduce your operating temperatures, your efficiency goes up. The silicone, or let me rephrase this. So like, it's important to note that when you look at the temperatures on an S19 right now, you're actually looking at temperature sensors that are on the board. There's like one exception, but it's not super common. So there's 4 or 2 temperature sensors on the board. That's not actually the temperature of the silicone because it's just a different place. The silicone is generating the heat, and that heat has to dissipate. So the board temperatures are actually a little bit cooler than the actual silicone. But you can use that as an indicator to know how hot your silicone is, just as a direction, right? Like if Bitmain actually has some recommendations on the offsets, but the numbers that we've seen is if your board temperatures are between like 45 Celsius and 55 Celsius, that's where you get some of the most uh, the best efficiency, meaning joules per terahash out of the machine. So lowering your clock speed, let's say by 50%, on its surface doesn't necessarily reduce your power consumption. However, by lowering your clock speed, you also lower your temperature, stressing the miner a little bit less, giving you the opportunity to get better efficiency. You don't get to see any of that if you're using Bitmain stock firmware. And so like some of this is about biding your time in the bear market, right? Like if you really do believe in Bitcoin and you've got this long term thesis, and you're willing to stick to it, even if you're not like making your margins like hundreds of percent or like let's say 5% better, 10% better, it can reduce your expenditures to where if you've got cash flow tightening, you might be able to make it through the next month where you see a bounce on Bitcoin, your revenue comes back up, and you get that breathing room, right? So again, it's not none of this is a silver bullet. It's giving you a tool to respond to the market conditions that are ultimately going to present themselves at some point.